Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's wonderful to have everybody back for yet another exciting episode of getting to meet the real you. That's effectively what we're doing. And I guess, like anything else in life, you always want things to follow some kind of chronological order. So the chronology over here is you've got to do first things first. Anytime in life. In fact, there's an interesting saying amongst Chassidim that the definition of a chassid, and that's what we're doing, right? We're learning Tanya, so we're learning the secrets of what it is to be a chassid. It's not just about wearing a black hat and being very joyous. So one of the secrets to being a chassid, we're told, is a chassid is a masudar. A chassid is an individual who does things in an orderly fashion, where everything is, it's logical, it's rational, it has a meaning, it has a particular significance of how exactly it is all set out. And so we have to be a masudar also. First things first. You don't just jump into a concept. First things first. You have to start at the beginning. So if we're going to talk, as we started to discover last week, if we're going to talk about the idea of having two souls, then obviously we have to do this in a rational order. We've got to start with the first soul first. So the big announcement last week, the big breakthrough last week, the, so to speak, surprise information that we came across last week was you don't have a soul, you have two souls. Now that could explain a lot of our confusion, incidentally. Why is it that so often we feel that we're tormented and that we're conflicted and we're pulled in different directions, and there's a part of me that wants to just do all the good things, and there's another part of me that just doesn't seem to be able to get it together. So there's so much about the experience of being a human and the experience of the spiritual tug-of-war that we have that starts to fall into place when you understand and appreciate the idea that there are actually two souls. And it reminds me of just a little bit of the story of our matriarch Rivka. Remember the story of Rivka? So here's Rivka, a woman who battled to have children, so it took a very long time until eventually she was blessed to have children. Long time, and a tremendous amount of prayer until eventually that blessing happened. And here she is, she's expecting what in her mind is a baby, and there seems to be this terrible conflict, this internal conflict. And the Torah tells us that at some point she goes for a spiritual ultrasound. The technology was a little bit different in those days. So spiritual ultrasound meant that you went to the local prophet just to find out what was going on the inside. There were no 4D scans or any of these interesting technologies that we have today. So you went to the prophet, and the prophet told you what was going on. So because Rivka was so concerned about what was going on inside of herself, she goes over to the local prophet at the time. She goes to inquire from Hashem what exactly is happening over here, what's going on over here. And what she determines is that she's told, Shnei goyim bevitnech. You don't have one child inside of you. You have two children, twins. And they're not just any ordinary twins, as a person might have expected, but these are shnei leumim. These are going to become two major superpowers. And they're constantly going to grapple and fight with each other. Now, that's exactly what happened. Out of her children, one was Yaakov, who is a very decent, calm, wonderful type of human being who becomes our forefather and the progenitor of the entire Jewish people. And then you got his twin, Esav. Esav, a completely different kind of a character. Rough about the edges, aggressive personality, very much into himself and gathering whatever he can by all means necessary. If that means violence or whatever, that's just the way that he is. Two totally different mindsets. And they then produce two different nations, and those two nations, the Edomite nation and the Jewish nation, have unfortunately been in conflict for most of history. So that's how we read the story, except that everything in the Torah is not only written as stories, and not only written as insights into how the world operates, but everything that's written in the Torah is also an insight into how we operate. So in the same way as Rivka looks inside and she says, I don't understand what's going on over here. And the Midrash tells us that what happened is when she would walk past a place of idolatry, she'd feel this tumult inside of her, like as if the baby wanted to go out and participate. And when she walked past a place of holiness, there was the same kind of drive as if the baby wanted to go to that place. And she thought, oh, you gewalt, you know what they say. The story of the mother hen who came across a scrambled egg. You know that story? That was the story. Oi, my crazy mixed up kid. So that's what she was worried about. There's some kind of a tension within the same person, and it's an element of comfort to her to discover that it's actually not one child, that there are two. And that's exactly what happens inside us as well. Because we have exactly the same kind of experiences. We have certain things in our lives that draw us into such a healthy space. Certain elements of our lives that just draw us towards what is wholesome, what is meaningful, what is altruistic, what is aspirational, what is transformational. And we're drawn there. Take, for example, my favorite example, and during the course of Tanya, you'll probably hear this example multiple times. My favorite example is the Jew of Yom Kippur versus the Jew of breaking the fast. It's a fascinating study in psychology. Here you have people sitting in shul at Ne'ilah. Ne'ilah is the pinnacle of the entire Yom Kippur experience. It's so focused. It's, we get to the end, we scream out, Hashem hu ho'elekim. Hashem is the ultimate God. It's such an uplifting place. You feel almost like your soul is going to fly out of your body. And then just a few short minutes later, the same passion towards God that we show at Ne'ilah is suddenly directed towards a piece of herring. It's fascinating. There you were so sublime and uplifted, and the next minute you're stuffing your face. It's like fascinating. And if you belong to a shul where they offer food for breaking of the fast, so then it's incredible to watch these people who are all like, in the zone and wearing white and meditating, jousting for food, elbowing each other. It's a fascinating transformation. So if I'm just one individual human, then I'm a crazy mixed up kid. But last week we got critical information. We got to understand that it's not that simple, and there are two souls, there are two dynamics, two forces that are working on us at any given time. And the better we understand the nature of those forces, and the better we understand how they operate, and the better we understand the nature of the conflict, the better positioned we will be to actually not only just understand ourselves, but manage ourselves. So that was wonderful information to come across, that there are two souls. But right now, it's very generalized information. Okay, so there are two souls. So what does that actually mean? Does it mean like having a dual SIM card in your phone? Does it mean like I have an extra battery pack? What exactly does it mean to have two souls? So first, souls first. If we're going to discuss the two souls, let's begin at a logical place. Where's the most logical place to begin any journey? Any journey, right? How do you start a journey? Well, the first thing you need to know in the old days, remember once upon a time before there was such a thing as GPS, we actually used to use maps. I was trying to explain the other day to my kids what it is to use a map. You remember, you used to get in the car and you used to drive to a destination. You like stop at the corner and look at the things and the street names and whatever the case is. Now, you can only start a journey, whether you're using a map or a GPS, by knowing where you are. Because if you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're starting from, how can you possibly work out where you're supposed to go? So what's the most logical place to begin the examination of our souls? With the first soul. The first soul doesn't mean it's the soul of highest priority necessarily. It means it's the first experience of a soul that we have. So that's going to be familiar to us. Let's first talk about things that we can relate to, things we identify in our daily experience. Once we've done that, then we can dig more deeply and say, and what lies beyond that? So this evening we begin first souls first. Let's start to examine what exactly is the nature of the first soul that we experience. But before we do that, one word of warning. Every language is more expressive about certain things than every other language. So, for example, we had a teacher in yeshiva, the famous Chassidic personality, Reb Mendel Futterfass, who was a man who dedicated his life to the point of personal sacrifice in Russia, and he spent many years in Siberia. And he was an incredibly astute human being, besides being a very pious individual and somebody who literally was dedicated 100% to God with no personal interest. So he used to say that English has the best vocabulary to describe hedonism. He says, each language, it tells you something about the culture of the people. He says, but there's no word in any other language that he was familiar with, and I'm not saying that he was necessarily, familiar in every language, but he said there's no word in any language that he was familiar with that could describe and capture the sensation of hedonistic pleasure like the word enjoy. You hear the word enjoy and you could already feel, you could sink your teeth into the word enjoy. You could feel the geschmack already right there. So every language has its particular vocabulary that it's better at than other languages. For example, if you're an Inuit, you have all kinds of words for snow. We have snow. That's it. Especially in South Africa, when it's 2021 and everybody's still talking about the snow of 1981, because that's how common it is in our experience, certainly in the Highveld. So, we don't have much vocabulary for snow. English does not have a great vocabulary for spiritual ideas. So that's our big disclaimer. When we use the word soul in English, the word soul is quite generic. And because it's generic, we don't get the nuances of understanding the different experiences and dimensions of the spiritual side of ourselves in English with the same fine-tuned ability that Hebrew will give us. So that's the word of warning. We're going to use the word soul a lot in this conversation, but just be aware of the fact that soul is not a good fit for the nuanced explanations we're going to give. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, but there are other words in English to describe the soul. Like, for example, you could speak of the spirit. You're right. But I don't think that the average person, or I don't think any person for that matter, is able to distinguish a meaningful distinction between spirit and soul. They're both pretty much the same thing. What we're going to learn over here, there will be serious distinctions between, for example, let's use the two words that are going to appear the most, between the word nefesh and the word neshama. So for the purposes of our conversation this evening, we're going to stick only to the word nefesh, because nefesh always represents the lowest, most basic expression of soul, whichever soul we're talking about. And because we're talking about the point of access, where we start the journey, which is with whatever's most familiar to us and closest to our experience, so you need to know that what is most familiar and closest to our experience is only a nefesh state. A neshama state is something we're going to have to learn about and we're going to have to discover over the course of time. Now, that's not to say we are automatically in the next level going to talk about neshama. We're still going to use the word nefesh there too, but the adjectives that are associated with that word nefesh are completely different in the first and the second soul. So let's start with this first soul and try and understand a little bit about what it is. In order to do that, we'll backtrack just a little bit to what we started speaking about last week, because you've got to give it flow, okay? So what did we start talking about last week? We said in order to truly understand the concept. What concept? Well, the purpose of this chapter was to ask questions about who are we and what are we supposed to become in the course of our spiritual development. Because before we were born, our souls swore a solemn oath that we would be a tzaddik and that we would not be a rasha. So we said, well, that's great and interesting, but until we know what tzaddik means or what rasha means, we can't even have that conversation. And what we have established so far is that we don't really know what any of them mean, but we do know they don't mean what we thought. We used to think that a tzaddik is just a good person, somebody who mostly does the right thing, and a rasha is a bad person, somebody who mostly does the wrong thing, and a beinoni is somewhere in the middle. Well, we're now past that, and we've understood that sometimes in order to really understand a concept, you first have to know what it is not, right? Before you can know what something is, first you have to reject your misguided understanding of what it is not. So we've thrown that out. Now we know that tzaddik and rasha are not so simplistic as good guy, bad guy, and beinoni, average guy. But in order to really understand it, the real explanation of this concept will only be understood based on something that is written by Rabbi Chaim Vital, who I mentioned last week was the primary student of the Arizal, one of the most revolutionary Kabbalistic contributors in history. And Rabbi Chaim Vital recorded his teachings, and he writes this, he just gives us the two sources. What does he write? That to every one of us, this is the uniqueness of being a Jewish person, every single one of us has echad tzaddik ve'echad rasha, regardless of whether we be the holiest of the holy or the lowliest of the lowly. Yesh shtei neshamos. We have two souls. A pivotal teaching, a revolutionary teaching, and everything that we're going to develop during the course of the chapters of Tanya that we'll study together, please God, this is going to be a tremendously significant bit of information that will keep recurring and will form one of the main foundations of everything we're going to learn. So whether you're the best of the best, or God forbid the opposite, you have two souls. And we derive that from a verse that says, God says, I have made souls. He's not just talking across the board that through history he's made millions and billions of souls, but rather it means that inside every person Hashem has made souls. So what are they? Shehein shtei nefashos. Now we're getting closer to the conversation that we can relate to. Before we talk about the lofty dimension of a soul that is called neshama, let's first talk about the accessible dimension that is called nefesh. And it's only really at that accessible dimension that you really have two souls. So what are they? Let's begin with the first one. Nefesh achas mitzad haklipa v'sitra achra. The first soul, you'll notice he doesn't actually say first. He says one soul, one of the two souls, because let's not be misled into thinking that if something is listed first, it makes it the priority, because it's not the priority. It's listed first because it's the most accessible, the most relatable. The part of ourselves that we can easily identify is what? It's a soul that comes from Klippa and Sitra Achra. Now, what the Alter Rebbe does here, and this is not unusual in classical Torah literature, is effectively he's placed a hyperlink at this point. Anybody who studied the Talmud will know, I saw somebody write this years ago, and I thought it was brilliant. He said the Talmud is the first hyperlinked document in history. Because if you're familiar with the Talmud, effectively, it's not like you would expect it. You start at the beginning and you go in a chronological order through a whole series of topics, and then eventually you reach the end. Instead, the nature of the Talmud is that you start a topic, and once you mention something, it's kind of a hyperlink to a whole different topic that is dealt with in great detail in another part of the Talmud, and it's not necessarily chronological as much as it is organic. Like Rabbi Adin Eben Yisrael, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz used to say, the Talmud is like an expression, it's like book form of Jewish life. It's unpredictable, it's organic, it is alive, and it's exactly the same over here with Tanya. So these two phrases, Klippa and Sitra Achra, this is a hyperlink to chapter 6. That's where these phrases will be dealt with properly. But we can't go any further without at least an introductory understanding. So let's do an introductory understanding just to appreciate what the nature is of one of our souls, the soul that we tend to encounter first. Before we do that, I have to share with you one of the great myths of the frum world. Don't tell anybody in the frum world that this is a myth. But one of the great myths of the frum world, and in fact, it wasn't all that long ago that I remember somebody coming over to one of the Tanya Shiurim and saying, I don't understand because I always heard. And then they said this particular myth. So here goes the myth. A child, prior to bar or bat mitzvah, is 100% guided by the Yetzer Hara, which means your evil inclination. And then, when you hit bar or bat mitzvah, that's the first opportunity that you have for your Yetzer Tov, for your positive inclination, to join you. Now, I don't know, but it seems like it's the other way around, actually. It seems that children are more angelic, children are more pure, and it's when you become an adult, particularly an adolescent, because that's really what happens at bar or bat mitzvah, it seems that that's when the monster starts to come out, don't you think? So what on earth are you saying, that a child is altogether Yetzer Hara? Well, it's a terrible misnomer, and the reason people misunderstand it has to do with what we're about to learn. The first experience of soul that a human being has by nature, and when a person is a child, you don't yet have the maturity to work yourself beyond your nature. So that is a part of us that comes from what we're going to call now Klippa and Sitra Achra. As you can see, somebody's made a comment in the chat that the suggestion that a person is fundamentally Yetzer Hara actually sounds like a Christian idea, born in sin. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because that is antithetical to Judaism, and it's a big part of what we're going to learn in time. So what do we say? The first soul is from a realm or dimension or reality called Klippa and Sitra Achra, which is basically, if you want to use a little bit more of a sci-fi reference, the dark side. And if you want a little bit more of a vegan reference, it's coconuts and watermelons. So effectively what we're talking about over here, the direct translation of the word Klippa is a shell. And the direct translation of the phrase Sitra Achra is the other side. Now that's important. We don't call it the dark side. We call it the other side, implying that there's a side where you should be, and then there's the other side, which is, so to speak, where you should not be. That's probably the best way to describe it, right? The other side. You've gone where you shouldn't necessarily have gone. So let's have a look. What is a klippa and what is Sitra Achra? Now, if you examine, that's why I mentioned the example of sorry, I'm just checking because some very strange-looking name just joined the shir. So if you're that strange-looking name, please let us know that you're a real person. Anyway, so what is the role? So what is the story of a coconut? I always wondered about it. What was the thing that motivated? What was it that got into somebody's head that they decided that they should actually open a coconut and look inside? Like, think about it. Think about it. You don't know what a coconut, you've never seen it before in your life. What prompted anybody to examine that behind this thing, this hairy, hard shell, maybe there's something that is edible? That's klippa. Klippa is the external outer covering of something that actually is worthwhile, except that the klippa is designed in such a way that when you encounter it, you think, why would I look any further? This looks uninviting. Now, why is there klippa? That's, again, something we'll discuss in greater detail later on in Tanya. But as you know from a fruit, it's primarily there to allow the fruit to remain protected. So that's why certain shells are hard and others are prickly, or whatever the case is, because that helps to keep the fruit protected. The only thing is, you really don't want to bite into a pineapple or a watermelon or a coconut that hasn't had the shell removed, because that's not going to be a pleasant experience. So your first brush, your first experience, probably what happened to the guy with the coconut is he was sitting under a tree and a coconut fell on his head and it cracked open, and that's how he noticed that there was something inside. It's unlikely that a person would have gone to investigate, right? So unless it kind of smacks you between the eyes, the average person, when you encounter something of klippa, you don't look further. You take it at face value, you say what you see is what you get, and you don't believe that there might be something of greater value on the inside. So we use klippa as a metaphor to describe anything that exists in this world, where when you look at it, you don't think that there's any point in looking any further, because you imagine that what you see is what you get. So in the old days, a klippa might have been described as the coconut shell, and in the modern world, we could call it your screensaver. Oh, it looks so nice, it's so pretty, it's so dazzling. Why would I want to look any further? It's like some kind of a virtual environment in front of you that makes you believe that's the environment to look at. So klippa implies anything that is designed in such a way that you see it and you don't see what it contains on the inside. The nature of how God has created his world is on the inside of everything is this beautiful divine energy. But the klippa looks so formidable that who wants to start digging? I mean, it's so tedious. Why don't we just live life as life comes? Why do I always have to philosophize? Why do I always have to find meaning? You look right now what's going on in the world and people are feeling so overwhelmed by all the challenges. You don't want to hear lectures about meaning. You just want a solution to the problem. Why would I want it? Somebody's going to come and tell me and explain to me all the Kabbalistic, whatever, the coronavirus, and it's shaped like this because of that. I don't want to hear that. I just want to hear, when can life go back to normal? That's the reality of klippa. Klippa says, please don't look deep. Please don't look further. Just accept things at face value. That's the first thing we need to realize about soul one. Soul one, meaning the undeveloped experience of us as humans, is just give me the path of least resistance. Let me see the world as the world presents itself, and let me not have to look any further. And let me not have to take any great responsibility over here. Because you know what happens. The minute you look further, suddenly you realize that also comes with an aspiration. And that means that I've got to do things because there's more to life than what meets the eye. And I'd much rather sing a life of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, because that's just easier in the now. So the first soul of ours prefers klippa. Let's just look at things as they present themselves. Let's not start mining for meaning. And the reason for that is because this soul belongs to a reality that is called Sitra Achra. What's Sitra Achra? The so-called other side. What exactly is that? You do remember that when Hashem created the world, the Torah reports it as Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, Hashem created. And the letter Beis, which is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the first letter of the Torah, is enlarged. And there are a whole lot of reasons for it. It's compared to like some kind of bracket. So there's more to the story before the bracket that we are not told. Or it's supposed to represent the number 2 because we say Rashis, which means the beginning. There are 2 beginnings. There are 2 purposes for which Hashem created the beginning of everything. And there's another insight, which is from the beginning, Hashem created a world of 2 realities. A dual reality world. Now that's an unnatural state. The natural state should be a singular reality. There's God and that's it. There is only God. That is the truest reality. But God is so good at what he does that he's able to create a world where it feels like and appears like there are 2 realities. And if you think about it, that's then played into the whole nature of our world. We live in a binary world, ones and zeros, dark and light, up and down, big and small. So as far as we're concerned, that's exactly how life is. Life is binary choices. And the reason we experience that is because we look at the klippa of life. But if I could look beneath the klippa, I would see that there's a unifying element. Just like if I had to take a microscope and look beneath the surface of anything, living or not, I would see that there is a subatomic reality and there's an energy reality where everything is linked together. But I don't see that. I look and I see the table is this and the wall is that and the window is this and I'm that and we're all made of different materials and we all exist different periods of time and we all have different characteristics and so forth. So it's a world of diversity. That diversity is primarily 2 choices. Either I see the oneness or I see the diversity. Those are the 2 choices how we live our lives. It's actually reflected even in the laws of Shabbos because we're taught that Shabbos is not just a day on the calendar to be able to rest, but Shabbos is a day that gives us insight and an understanding and appreciation of the whole of creation. Like creation builds and builds and builds and builds and eventually hits the pinnacle of creation. And what happens? Shabbos. Shabbos is that meaning of creation. It's the insight, it's the purpose, it's the richness of creation. So interestingly enough, when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, one of the big laws of Shabbos is the law of transfer from one domain to another domain. On Shabbos, I'm not permitted to take something from the Reshus HaYochid, which means my private space, into Reshus HaRabim, which is a public space. So Chassidus explains it like this. Reshus HaYochid, again, the English doesn't do justice. The original Hebrew is much more powerful and nuanced. Reshus, the domain HaYochid of the one and only, that's the better translation. Reshus HaRabim, the domain of the diversified public. On Shabbos, I realize that I don't go between the 2. I shouldn't cross over between the 2. There's got to be a distinction. I have to know that is Reshus HaRabim. That is a place of diversity and a place of conflict. And Shabbos is where I should really spend time in Reshus HaYochid, in oneness with God. So that represents the whole of Judaism. There is Sitra di Kedusha, the side of holiness. Now, holiness is not some kind of highfalutin abstract concept. Holiness means simply an awareness of the fact that Hashem Echad, Hashem is the one and only reality. That is called holiness. Sitra Achra, the alternative side, is where you think, maybe not. So to put that into practical terms, let's just say that Hashem says, as he does in the Torah, that I should not do anything to harm another person, whether I harm them physically, whether I harm them financially, whether I harm them verbally. I'm not allowed to do any of that. There are specific laws that relate to each of those different things. I'm not allowed to do it. So, Sitra di Kedusha, from the perspective of holiness, those behaviors are out of the question. If Hashem said, don't speak badly about somebody, it's not negotiable. If Hashem said, don't overcharge a person for an item in your shop, it's out of the question. There's nothing to discuss about overheads and about the markets and about being able to put food about it. That's what Hashem said. That's called Sitra de Kedusha. There's only one reality, and it's a blindingly clear reality, and that's what you follow. Sitra Achra is the side of Achra. There's another option. God said, this is the way to behave. I actually think there might be another way to behave. So under these particular circumstances, I justify to myself speaking badly about somebody or overcharging them when I sell them something, or whatever particular thing it might be. So the first soul, the first nefesh of ours that we encounter, what we need to know about it is, it's the part of us that views the world from a klippa sitra achra perspective. That means my natural state, before I start to work, when I'm still a diamond in the rough, in my raw state, I don't see things as they are. And I don't see the purpose. And I don't see connection. And I'm not naturally attracted to do what Hashem wants. Instead, what do I see? See my interests. That's an incredibly useful insight into what this first nefesh is. Self-interested. Self-preservation. Survival of the fittest. Everything that Darwin would have spoken about would speak to this soul. Where does the soul operate? This soul manifests itself in the human body experience through the blood flow because its primary goal is to keep the human alive. Okay, and as it says in the pasuk in the parasha of Acharei Mois in the book of Vayikra, ki nefesh habosar badom hi. The soul of the flesh is in the blood. Now we all know very well that there's another religion that has another way of interpreting that verse and believes that blood is there to atone for souls. Nothing could be further from the truth because read the verse. It doesn't say ki nishmas ha'adam because the soul of a person, badam he is in their blood. It doesn't say that at all. It says ki nefesh ha'basar, the soul of the flesh is in the blood. That means that there are, as we're going to discover, two ways to describe the two souls. One is the soul of the flesh, and the other is the soul of the person. Which means this. The soul of the flesh effectively means, if you ask the average person, how does the average person describe or define a soul? The average person. I'll tell you, your soul is some kind of a spiritual battery pack that is stuck inside of you. As long as it's running and charged, you live. God forbid it runs out of charge. That's the end of the story. Somebody who's a little bit more spiritual than that will tell you, no, your soul is more than just simply a mechanism to keep you alive. Your soul is like a portal to connect you to other realities and other dimensions and that kind of thing. And it's the source of the goodness of your character, and it's the source of your spiritual intuition and so forth. Here we discover that to say your soul is your battery is absolutely accurate for the first soul. That's its job. Nefesh habasar. It is a soul designed to fulfill whatever the body needs in order to survive. So it's not just instinct, it's something far more complex than instinct because it is a soul at the end of the day. And a soul means that it's got a brain, and it means that it has developed emotional needs, and it's got the ability to innovate, and it's got perseverance, and a lot of really strong, powerful, healthy characteristics, as we'll discover. But its orientation is me. Nefesh habasar. I need to keep this flesh alive. Now, if we didn't have the soul, if there was a way to somehow drive it out of our system, God forbid, we wouldn't want to eat. And we wouldn't feel the need to earn money, and we wouldn't have the interest in starting a family or any of those things that ultimately require some kind of personalized interest in order to happen. So it's not an enemy that has to be excised from us. Let's be clear about that. It's just our first underdeveloped self. So all of these people who speak about a child being only a Yetzer Hara, it's inaccurate. They should be saying a child is primarily nefesh, we haven't described it yet, nefesh habasar. This soul of the flesh, that is primarily what they are. And if you don't believe me, here's an easy way to illustrate it. Have you ever in your life encountered a newborn baby? Obviously, right? And everybody looks at a newborn baby, wow, so cute, so pure, so beautiful. And then, of course, there's like a grandmother hovering in the back saying, it's got this one's ears and that one's nose and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, like everybody's like, oh, so goo goo gaga over this new baby. Except if you're the new mother. I'm not saying, God forbid, that the new mother doesn't go all googly-eyed over her baby, but at 2 a.m., if a mother is objective, if she wasn't blinded by this natural love that she has for her baby, she'd actually say, I've never met such a selfish creature in my life. Think about it. 2 a.m., for heaven's sake, you have no consciousness of the fact that I also have a life. You're up again, and all you want is me. I need to eat. I need to relieve myself of whatever, right? That's what I need. I need you to play with me. I have jet lag. Somehow these kids seem to come out with jet lag. Have you ever in your life encountered a more selfish being than a newborn baby? Why? Because it's just the Nefesh HaBahamis, as we're going to call it soon. We're going to call it soon by that name. Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul. The impulsive soul, Nefesh HaBasar. All it has at this point in time is a need to survive. And in order to survive, I need comfort, I need cleaning, I need feeding. That's what I need in order to survive. This is not bad, it's just undeveloped. What you hope is that you reach a point where you grow beyond that. And that's really the objective of being a human, and particularly being a Jewish person, is to reach a point where I'm no longer just the Nefesh HaBasar, where my spiritual side is not just simply about feeding my bodily needs. That's where we need to get to. Right? That's the goal. That's the objective. That's where we need to reach. So where's this Nefesh HaBasar? Badam. It's in the blood. What does it mean it's in the blood? So it's quite interesting, because one of the principles that we all accept in life is that if you have two realities that are quite different from each other, you always need something that can bridge the two realities, and it's got to have a similarity between both sides. So, for example, if you had two warring factions and you want to somehow start peace negotiations, you need somebody who can sit in the middle, who gets both sides of the story and is not totally invested in either side. So they can afford to be objective, but they can also understand what's going on, and that way they can bring them both to the table and can actually have a conversation. So there are two sides to a human being. There's a spiritual side and a physical side. And by rights, they should not be able to connect, because the physical has its rules of physics and the spiritual has its rules of metaphysics. So there's no way that they should be able to connect. Therefore, Hashem designed the human being that inside of our system, we would have a part of the physical that is as close to being non-physical as you could possibly get in a physical reality. What does that mean? So let's just step out of this for half a second, because it's going to be relevant to the next part of the chapter anyway, so we'll do it in greater detail then. But there's a very well-known principle people attribute it to Aristotle, even though it has Torah source that goes back even further. And that is the idea that everything that exists is comprised of four basic elements: fire, air, water, and earth. And on that spectrum, earth is the most materialistic of the four, and fire is the least materialistic. And that's not just because fire is constantly moving and doesn't have a very specific shape at any given time, and not only because fire has the ability to generate energy as opposed to the others that don't necessarily generate energy of their own, but the main thing about fire is that it defies gravity. And so it, as the expression goes, you probably learned this in early science when you were still young, heat rises. So that characteristic of heat, to rise, tells us that heat has a spiritual component to it. It's almost like it wants to leave the materialistic world. Now, the heat regulator of the human body is your blood. We're warm-blooded creatures. Now, everybody, I'm sure, now knows, I don't think most people ever knew what the average temperature, healthy range of temperature should be for a human being. But thanks to COVID, now everybody knows that the average range of human temperature, because you get your temperature taken I don't know how many times a day these days, so you kind of know exactly where it's supposed to be, right? Somewhere between 36 and 37, you're good. So blood is the regulator of the body's heat. And blood also has the ability to flow, so that anything that moves is, of course, less entrenched in the physical reality. So Nefesh HaBasar, the soul that has to be inside the body, keep the body alive, needs a vehicle that is kind of on the cusp between physical and spiritual. That's blood. Nefesh habasar badam he. The soul of the flesh is in the blood. That does not mean that if somebody gets a blood transfusion, they get somebody else's soul. It means that the interface to allow connection between a soul and a body is blood. Drain somebody completely of blood, God forbid, there is no longer a vehicle, and therefore the soul is no longer capable of being inside that body. So welcome to the first of our two souls. Not first in importance, not first in priority, first in experience. The first experience I have and I have to have from the minute I breathe is a part of me that motivates me to keep the flesh alive. Nefesh habasar. It is a soul that cares for the needs of the body, for which reason it has another name as well. It actually has two other names. The one we'll use more colloquially in the future, but the other name that it has that we'll look at first is Nefesh hachiyunis. So later on, when we revisit this, we're going to call it the Nefesh hachiyunis, which means the animating soul, because that's its job. Its job is to keep the human being animated. Its job is to keep the human being alive. Its job is to run the urges and desires that we need to stay on terra firma. Now, the other soul we're going to encounter doesn't work that way at all, but we'll still get there. So you have to ask yourself this question. If this is a spiritual dimension of what I am, it's a nefesh, it's a soul, and its primary need and occupation and responsibility is to keep me alive, then it makes a lot of sense that its biggest concern is me. And that's good. Self-preservation. It's really important. Bear in mind how much Judaism how much importance Judaism places on life. So to stay alive is like really important. So I need to have the soul. And it needs to do its job. What would you think is the potential danger of having such a powerful component of who I am that is so fixated on me? Where could this go wrong? Because anything, of course, could start off as a good idea, could start off as something which is really healthy, but it could unravel over the course of time. So yes, of course, I need self-preservation. If I become some kind of a doormat and I think I have no value, that's a problem, serious problem. So I need this part of myself. However, if I don't keep it in check, remember this is a raw state. If I don't learn how to upgrade it, how to fine-tune it, how to educate it, negative things could happen. And that's why the third term that we use to refer to the soul is Nefesh habahamis. So it's an animating soul, Nefesh hachiyunis, and it's an animal soul, animal, Nefesh habahamis. Now you could have the most incredible animal in the world, but until such time as you train that animal to behave in a particular way, until such time as you train that animal not to mess all over the house, until such time as you train that animal that it can't attack the neighbor's animal, you might have a potential problem on your hands. And so that's what the Alter Rebbe, the author of Tanya, wants us to understand, and is going to explain to us in the next piece, which please God we'll do next week. We have to be well aware of how this nefesh could spiral out of control. And we need to be able to identify what are the usual areas, that's the, so to speak, usual suspects of where this soul will spiral out of control. Because when we understand that, we begin to understand how we work. So please God, next week, that's what we'll do. We'll have a look at the 4 major categories of misbehavior that are likely to expect from the animal or animating or fleshy soul of ours.